Good morning. Good morning. Sorry. Welcome to Flawed Dogs again. We are at the point where it is almost showtime. They snuck in and they've sabotaged all the show dogs by shaving them and gluing them and painting them. And now we'll find out what's going to happen. 31, dance. Sabotage team, fall back, whispered Sam, running through the dog stalls moments before the humans returned from lunch. His happy saboteurs poked their heads up from their tasks. The show dogs still napped, professional beauty being exhausting work. Wee Willie spat out the electric shaver in his mouth. What's the matter? Get back into the clothes, we're suiting up. Bug trotted over to Sam, trying to keep up with him. We're not finished, Sam. Doesn't matter, change of plans, let's go. Go and do what? Said Bug, running behind. Sam and his team disappeared again into the dark corner where they had left Mrs. Nutbush's things and started piling atop each other below the clothes, putting the poor woman back together once again. Sam slipped the collar over his head, still connected to the leash that was tied to the empty sleeve and glove. Jeeves pulled himself into the position but stuck a foot into Fabio's ear, making the two-legged mutt jump and sending the lot of them tumbling to the floor in a furred heap. Come on, the others are leaving, whispered Sam, growing frantic. Tell Jeeves my ear is not a footstool, said Fabio. Wee Willie looked out from under the blue wool fur hat as the confused commando started construction yet again. Sam, he said, what are we doing? Meeting an old friend, said Sam. Trumpets blew and the lights dimmed in the arena as the crowd roared in anticipation of the final competition and the naming of the grand champion. The judge stood in the center of the red carpet and spoke into the microphone. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the finalists for the Westminster Best in Show, the most beautiful dogs in all the world. A roar erupted, shaking the very foundations of the arena. TV cameras swung over to the entrance arc, waiting for the dogs and their owners to emerge. One by one, the champions trotted out in a processional line with their humans close behind. All shapes, sizes, and breeds, they circled the carpet and then took their places surrounding the judge, sitting regally and expectant as the crowd's cheering grew louder. And then quieter. And then a complete hush. Silence. The crowd had noticed something. The dogs. Something about them was not quite right at all. The fur of a Bolivian elkhound from France wasn't tan as it should have been. It was lime green, with orange stripes, with happy faces. A Spanish Shih Tzu's lips were dyed hot pink to match his ears, nose, and feet. A Scottish Terrier's bottom was striped yellow and black like a bumblebee. The flowing locks of Britain's favorite sheepdog were strung with beads, plastic army men, and Cheerios. Those of a collie were worked into rock-hard spikes of hair gel, pointing in all directions, much like a congealed porcupine. A miniature pool's back was shaved smooth of kinky fur, except for the words, I'm with the idiot holding the leash. The dogs, regional champions all, stared at each other in embarrassed silence. Someone high in the audience giggled, and another, and then another. The laughter then began to build and roll like a great wave approaching the beach, finally cresting in a thundering crescendo of screaming, howling hoots. The dogs' owners looked around in horror at the bellowing mob. They'd found their dogs in this condition when they'd returned from lunch. They had no time to change anything. Their dogs were a laughingstock. Except for one. A lone, magnificent poodle. Cassius. He sat perfect and unchanged and sublimely gorgeous, watching the others with disgust. The judge, standing in the middle of the red carpet, recovered from her shock and waved for the crowd to quiet, which they did. Regaining her composure, the judge stiffened, raised her eyebrows, and pushed her glasses up her nose. Then she walked to Cassius and waved a single finger to the right. This was the command to begin this judging run, a trot down the short length of carpet and back for a final inspection of form, fur, line, and lineage. Cassius stood and led his human handler down and then back, his head high, his back arched, and his tail at exactly a 38-degree angle. The crowd hushed. This was a champion. This was the most beautiful French poodle in the world. As Cassius and his handler returned to his place at the edge of the carpet, the crowd began to applaud. Cassius beamed. This was going to be the day. His day. the place where his whole life had been pointed. The judge moved toward him. She had only to extend a single index finger over his head, and he would be world champion. High above everything, up on the roof, Madam and Tusk looked down through the skylight, waiting for the signal from Sam. The signal for Tusk to ram the southern support for the 10,000-gallon water tank, causing it to fall forward and land at the edge of the skylight, dumping its now muddy contents through the portal, plummeting down the 150 feet to the red carpet below, and on to the heads of the world's most celebrated show dogs sitting on it. "I can't see Sam," said Madam, scanning the arena. "Wait, there he is." A side curtain at the edge of the show floor parted. The crowd suddenly went silent again. The judge, her hand beginning to move up toward Cassius, looked up to see a light dachshund competitor moving toward the red carpet, pulling his slower human handler, swaying and stumbling behind him in a leopard skin coat, blue voile hat, and baby seal fur boots. The announcer cleared his throat, his voice booming over the loudspeakers. "Arriving fashionably late is number 46, Mrs. Corinthian Nutbush, and her miniature red dachshund, Mr. Toodles." Sam trotted stiffly in place of Mr. Toodles, but his eyes were locked onto Cassius, who watched him approach with a skeptical, bemused expression. Sam pulled and steered his confused team to the open space next to the huge poodle. He sat down, his eyes never leaving those of Cassius, who stared back, wondering why this dachshund looked vaguely familiar. "He's only feet away," thought Sam, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. He fought to keep his lips from curling upward in rage, revealing his thoughts. "A single leap to the perfectly shaved and perfumed throat. Nobody could stop me." "Now," he thought. "Your chance is now." He glanced up to Cassius's handler, standing next to the dog. He was moments from killing. It wasn't Mrs. Beaglehole. In fact, at that moment, Mrs. Beaglehole was sitting with Uncle Hamish in the audience with a heat pack around her ankle and an ice pack around her throat. Now standing with Cassius was a tall, very nervous-looking young woman with long brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and a red bow. She turned and glanced down at Sam. Sam's blood went cold. He drew a breath and held it, afraid to even release his lungs lest the person in front of him disappear. This couldn't be real. This he never expected. This he hadn't allowed himself to think about for 3 years. Sam scanned the face staring at him and saw that the large brown eyes of a little girl, gleaming with possibility and wonder and wide open to the limitless of love, had softened into those of a young woman. Though these eyes were sadder somehow, thought Sam, but they were the same. There's a picture of Cassius and the handler. Who do you think it is? Say it. Say it. Heidi. Heidi. Sam's head spun. He closed his eyes and then opened them again. It wasn't one of his cruel dreams of a former life he had tried to forget over the last many years. No, she was actually there, staring at him, trying like Cassius to make sense of the odd feeling of familiarity they both had about this beautiful dachshund. From below the leopard coat, Old Blue whispered to Fabio underneath his fanny, "What's wrong with Sam?" Fabio shrugged, which nearly toppled the lot of them. "Number 46, Mr. Toodles and his owner, Mrs. Corinthian Nutbush, please make your judging run," said the judge, suddenly clearing Sam's swimming head. Sam looked around. Everyone was watching him, waiting, hushed. For Sam, suddenly the thought of killing Cassius, the thought that had dominated all others for a week, was replaced by another. Heidi. Once lost, she might be his again. She stared down at him. What was she waiting for? Suddenly he knew. She was waiting to see the old Sam the Lion. He stepped onto the red carpet, pulling his Mrs. Nutbush, causing them to stumble and sway. "Sam, what are we doing?" whispered Bug from below the fur hat. But Sam was too lost in the moments from a previous time to answer. He pulled his team to the center of the carpet as the judge and Heidi and Cassius and 100,000 people in the arena and millions around the world watched. Then he stopped. He looked back at Heidi, still staring with a quizzical expression. And then he danced. Just as he and the little girl had danced in the Vermont backyard of McLeod Acres a lifetime ago. He leapt and twirled and bounced, his mind suddenly awash in a feeling approaching happiness, one that he hadn't dared allow for a very long time. Cassius stared, awash in his own memories. I've seen this before. Heidi was thinking the same thing, but her mind couldn't make sense of it. Sam was gone, destroyed years ago when she was a little girl. Dogs don't return from the dead. In the audience, Uncle Hamish stood, staring, disbelieving. The crowd began laughing again at the dancing, spinning dachshund. They hadn't seen such a performance at a dog show before, but the dachshund was quite beautiful. But then, suddenly, a hush fell upon the arena. The Douglas Tuft! Someone cried out in the audience. More people pointed and shouted, The Douglets! Outstretched fingers shot toward the top of Sam's skull, pointing at the tiny curled wisp of hair that Sam had instructed Madam to glue on top of his head. The Douglas Tuft, the judge said in a whispered awe, her eyes brimming with tears. She picked up the huge silver Best in Show chalice and blue championship ribbon and began to move toward the heartbreakingly flawless dachshund. A thunderous cheer then arose from the now standing, fist-pumping, astonished crowd. The Douglets! Sam the lion was cooking. He was on fire. The roars and cheers drove his spinning and bouncing to a frenzied pace, and he twirled and danced and flipped, and then it was suddenly quiet again. Sam stopped. The crowd was standing, staring, mute. He looked over at Heidi, who stared but held a hand to her open mouth. He looked around on the red carpet. Pieces of fur and leather and tape and glue lay scattered. His artificial leg lay several feet away from him. Sam stood, leaning slightly on his 3 feet, ragged and shorn of his deceit. He blinked, as if waking from a rapturous dream. But it was not a dream. High atop the roof, Tusk and Madam stared down through the open skylight at the events unfolding below. Oh dear, said Madam very simply. Watching from the edge of the red carpet, suddenly Cassius knew. He suddenly saw everything clearly. The big poodle leapt forward, snapping the leash held by Heidi. He reached the backside of the fake Mrs. Nutbush, still teetering close to Sam, and he sunk his teeth